Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. It's late and I'm sorry if I seem kind of tired. But this should be the last episode in our series on John Dewey's Artist Experience, chapters 1 through 3. And it's the last, like, I guess, 15 pages of the text of chapter 3. And, it's kind of complicated, so I'm not as concerned about like being in a good mood. I am in a good mood, but I'm not as concerned about being like chipper and full of energy. Um, just because it's complicated. The way I want to frame the rest of this series and this chapter is that it- what the rest of what Dewey discusses about an experience. We've covered a lot about, okay, so like I guess we could just recap. Um, in chapter 1, Dewey starts by critiquing museums and dualism and the separation of art away from everyday life, because that also separates matter from spirit and the mundane or the commonplace from a proliferation of enrichment through spiritual experiences and aesthetic experiences. In the second part of chapter 1, he goes across the idea of the live creature through evolutionary biology and sketches some general first philosophical contours, more or less, so to speak, about what this creature needs and what it shares in common with other creatures. What it shares in common with other creatures are needs for food, shelter, and just generally like having to engage with its environment to accomplish some end. This necessity of engagement draws it out from itself and creates a disharmony and a lack. Once this is resolved, there's growth in the creature, presumably if they continue to learn and um, create some amplification of energy and life through it. In chapter 2, Dewey continues to show the continuum between material and ethereal things and break down some of the old prejudices. So he works from the definition of the live creature, or the idea of a live creature, of the live creature, and just fleshes it out more with his discussion of aesthetics, emotion, experience itself, rhythms, etc. Let's get the screen sharing happening before I, for whatever reason, forget. And then in chapter 3, what we've done so far is um, covered some general contours of having an experience, um, which an experience is like memorable in and of itself. It has a sort of self-contained, rounded quality. And Dewey's gone on to show us that the self-contained, rounded quality of that experience is the aesthetic aspect itself or the emotional aspect itself. He's also shown that the that all experiences are simultaneously emotional, aesthetic, um, and practical or intentional or volitional or materially ethically oriented. Additionally, in chapter 2, we discussed the relationship between sense and language and perception. And it's these kind of it's that relationship exemplifies continuums in general for Dewey, where he resolves traditional conflicts and enriches the discourse at the same time. And it makes sense. I like it at least. So an experience is reflective of where it's been. It accumulates those lessons. It lets those lessons surge forth into the present as perception and not reducing the present to the past through recognition. Um, it's goal-oriented and intentional, volitional, so it has some kind of direction toward the future. and it's open in the present to being changed. Um, Once it gets to the end, it will be the culmination of a journey. It's not just a static point, but also a process. In the rest of chapter 3, Dewey's going to use the common patterns, what he calls the common patterns in various experiences, what we see here, as the architectonic template, I guess we could say. Sort of the rest of the stuff in the chapters follows the same structure. So the common patterns in various experiences are doing and undergoing. When I do something like the most obvious example is lifting a stone. I mean, that's not something you do often, but let's say, or you go to pick up a package. I don't know if you order packages. I don't order packages. I'm boycotting things. I don't spend money right now. Um, okay, let's reference one of my favorite movies. I love Howl's Moving Castle. In Howl's Moving Castle, there's Mr. Turnip Head Man, who, no spoilers, but the dude always gets stuck upside down. So let's say you go to rescue Turnip Head Man and you pull on it and you yank and he's still stuck. He's not coming down. So when you yank, you go and you get stuck back, right? You can kind of imagine that reciprocity of action. In the notes on this, I even mentioned Newton's laws, I think. For every action, there's an equal but opposite reaction. I think that's the third law of motion. I'm not a physicist. Um, but no, the stone example that Dewey uses is just really it works. It's a good example. So he says you lift up a stone, like maybe you pick up a rock that you want, I don't know. Or maybe you have rocks in your yard and you want to organize these rocks into a fire pit. How about that? You go to pick up a rock and here's the context where you're holding the stone in. Because I don't know, I don't lift stones like this in the palm of my hand, but that's what you imagine. And you lift the stone, that's the doing. But with the doing, there's an undergoing. So let's say you make an initial movement to lift it, but it like pushes back on you and it's heavier than you expect. Or somebody like hands you a bag or your backpack or something and it like sinks your arm because it's heavier than you expect. Dewey says that we respond that one, the doing had the undergoing as its reciprocity. But the undergoing that we were given also has a further doing because then we exert more strength to hold the stone up, or we adapt in some way to resolve the tension created by the response to our doing. And so doing and undergoing keep creating this reciprocal, revolving intercalation between the two that develops and progresses the experience and the aesthetic production and the aesthetic perception, all of those things um, of their own accord, of their own nature, they make themselves. Experience makes itself in this sense. The other kind of framework that's at play in this last bit is another short passage he distinguishes where he combines doing and undergoing of various objects or various intentionalities into a third principle, which is meaning. And meaning is the unified perception of cause and effect in a single motion. So with this So you have doing and undergoing, and then you have meaning as the unified perception of cause and effect. If you can see how the cause flows through the effect, then you have a meaning that you can manipulate and do something intentional with. If the creature is sensitive to the doings and undergoings in various artistic languages and aesthetic mediums, Dewey calls this, and can manipulate those through meaning, through the perception of meaning and the intentionality of recreating the meaning. Dewey calls this intelligence. And it's a flexible, fluid understanding of intelligence. And I think it works. Um, this is why previously in the chapter, we saw he said that like, quite a few pages back. Hence, an experience of thinking has its. This is when he was concerned with showing that there was no clear distinction between intellectual, aesthetic, and practical experience. But hence, an experience of thinking has its own aesthetic quality. It differs from those here. So he's going to show that like mathematics and thinking and language can be aesthetic. Uh, in the same and just in the same way that thinking can be aesthetic, aesthetics and arts can be thinking and are thinking. And in fact, it's a highly denigrated form of thinking that um, is not respected properly. And Dewey says it actually requires probably more intelligence because signs are easy to manipulate without understanding what they mean. Whereas small sensitivities to changes in perception or changes in responsiveness, this is why teaching is an art. It has to be a sensitivity and an intention. But going back to this paragraph and formally in the chapter, we'll read this, and I think that'll prime us back, and we'll go to doing and undergoing. Um, we need to look at the questions too. But hence, an experience of thinking has its own aesthetic quality. It differs from those experiences that are acknowledged to be aesthetic, but only in its materials. The material of the fine arts consists of qualities which he later says are harder to manipulate, and so they require possibly more intelligence or a more sophisticated or difficult intelligence. That of experience having intellectual conclusion are signs of symbols or symbols. Um, so the materials or the medium, right, the matter, the middle thing through which the art is produced or transformed as a labor are signs or symbols having no intrinsic quality of their own, but standing for things that may in another experience be qualitatively experienced. The difference is enormous. It is one reason why the strictly intellectual art will never be popular as music is popular. Nevertheless, the experience itself has a satisfying emotional quality because it possesses internal integration and fulfillment, reached through ordered and organized movement. So, anyway, um, and this intelligence, right, is excellence in doing, excellence in perceiving, and excellence in causally relating those things. Doing and perceiving from multiple parties' perspectives and in multiple languages across multiple fronts within multiple intentionalities, parameters, considerations, etc. Um, you probably can see from the extensivity of the guiding questions and the responses to them offered, uh, just how rich, complex, versatile, and powerful Dewey's thinking is. It's rigorous, it's interwoven, it's coherent, it's comprehensive. Um, anyway, the only real other, I mean, there are 2 and a half pages at the very end that are a conclusion, but the only other real aspect between here and there So lots of great meat and details along the way, but the other main structural component is, um, like I've alluded to already, the fact that all artistic making is a form of perception as well. So there's a traditional distinction between like in this instance, the distinction was between doing and undergoing, but there's a further traditional distinction, right, between artistic creation and artistic perception, like in a museum or just as a critic or as an audience member. And because we have different words in the English language for them, Dewey explains artistic and aesthetic, we don't really connect the processes that are common to both types of experience or practices within experience. Um, and so to resolve, it's really like either a biconditional or a deconstructive approach. But to resolve this, Dewey is going to start from each point and show the intercalation of the other within it. It's really deconstructive. But 50 years before Derrida, and I have no idea about the relationship between Derrida and Dewey, if Derrida read Dewey or whatever. But um, this cross-directional deconstructive approach uh, will res again resolve the continuum. And I'm probably not going to try to read all the answers that are in. I'm not going to read the long answers. Um, I don't know. I guess I will. But I gave you guys like a big overview of what else is left because there's a bunch of meat here. So we've got 75 minutes left before I'd want to cut this episode, and we can push it a little bit. Um, Hopefully it won't take that long, just because I don't like crazy long episodes. I'm sure there's other stuff I've forgotten, but I think that's kind of intelligence is the art. So let's do our guiding questions. What are the common patterns of every experience? What gives meaning? We've already answered both of those. And like I said, the answers to those two form the help us form an understanding for the rest of the chapter. What kind of intelligence does the artist require? And then we'll like parse some of those details. And some of those are from like brainstorming with a in-person class. Well, quite a lot of them actually. How are the production and the perception of artworks interwoven? In the structure of the text, that at that point Dewey only really answers from one direction, from the direction of the artist, not from the direction of the perceiver or the aesthetic or epicure, as he says. And so when we get down to a further question, how is perception also a form of doing slash making through surrender to the perception and a recreation? Well, yeah. Um, that's kind of the other direction in this biconditional or deconstructive approach that I've discussed. Uh, and then how do artworks make themselves? We can also see that that's a an ongoing consequence of the like entangled, back and forth, reciprocal, interwoven, doing, undergoing across all objects and persons in the world and in life. But the causal reciprocity is what really makes it of its own creation, makes nature create itself. Like, in a sense, God creating all of this through us. 10, what three traits are required of the artist? Like I said, excellent doing, excellent perception, and excellent relationing, relating of those things. So relations of quality, skillful action, and acuity and sensitivity of perception. There's a specific phrase, there are specific phrases that Dewey uses at a certain moment in the text, about halfway through the pages we have left. Um, so I'm really just, tying all of these things together over and over again to show the consistencies and the connections that argue for the different stages of a highly nuanced and articulated presentation of information. And then the perception as a form of making, and then how do emotions permeate their material occasions? We looked at this one from in the last episode because we're looking ahead. Which characteristics of experience are dominant in aesthetic experience? I've already answered this, but I didn't say it was a guiding question or anything, and we'll cover it again. And or two more. What do James's birds, flights, and perching symbolize or represent? Another doing and undergoing intercalated example, because we'll look at the way that resting is a form of preparing to do. Um, and then the last one, when, i.e., under what conditions, is an object peculiarly and dominantly aesthetic? Also answered that one. Sorry again, I'm just tired. I'm not trying to be short or grumpy. Okay, what are the common patterns of every experience? There are, therefore, common patterns in various experiences, no matter how unlike they are to one another in the details of their subject matter. There are conditions to be met without which an experience cannot come to be. The outline of the common pattern is set by the fact that every experience is the result of interaction between a live creature and some aspect of the world in which he lives. A man does something. He lifts, let us say, a stone. In consequence, he suffers something. The weight, strain, texture of the surface of the thing lifted. The properties thus undergone determine further doing. The stone is too heavy or too angular, not solid enough, or else the properties undergone show it is fit for the use for which it is intended. The process continues until a mutual adaptation of the self and the object emerges, and that particular experience comes to a close. What is true of this simple instance is true as to form of every experience. The creature operating may be a thinker in his study, and the environment with which he interacts may consist of ideas instead of a stone. But interaction of the two constitutes the total experience that is had, and the close which completes it is the institution of a felt harmony. An experience has pattern and structure, because it is not just doing and undergoing in alternation, but it consists of them in relationship. To put one's hand in the fire that consumes it is not necessarily to have an experience. The action and its consequence must be joined in a perception. This relationship is what gives meaning. So 6, what gives meaning? 5, what are the common patterns of every experience? We'll get a little bit further and I'll go back and read those answers. The scope, this relationship is what gives meaning. To grasp it is the objective of all intelligence. So he's already said it very directly here, but he's saying so much that you might miss it. That's why when he repeats things, you can tell that they're important. The scope and content of the relations measure the significant content of an experience. A child's experience may be intense, but because of lack of background from past experience, relations between undergoing and doing are slightly grasped, and the experience does not have great depth or breadth. No one ever arrives at such maturity that he perceives all the connections that are involved. There was once written by Mr. Hinton a romance called The Unlearner. It portrayed the whole endless duration of life after death as a living over of the incidents that happened in a short life on earth. and continued discovery of the relationships involved among them. All right, and then he's gonna look at interferences for doing and with perception of the relations, which is really similar to interferences for having aesthetic perception, because the perception of relations is necessary for aesthetic perception. Um, so what are the common patterns of every experience? Doing and undergoing, not in alternation, but in simultaneous relationship, happening always at the same time and in the same action under different perspectives. Equal but opposite reactions, i.e., Newton's third law of motion. The lifting of a stone with my arm and with my hand is both an intentional doing as well as a responsive undergoing, whereby I also feel the weight of the stone on my musculature, the data from maybe datum, from which informs the forthcoming action as a responsive mutual fine-tuning. So this is also the genetic theory of truth. In this way, artworks from William James. In this way, artworks determine themselves by communicating to the artist the missing feedback of their achievement, the expectation of their arising recreation or recreation. 6, what gives meaning? Meaning is perceived through the unified perception, no, that's not really redundant, of cause and effect, especially as relations between mean and consequence, or between method and outcome, via creative, practical intention, i.e., being able to perceive the effect with the cause, simultaneously as part of the same process as one flowing, continuing act. Undergoing determines further doing insofar as the feedback informs the success of my actions and intentions through a given means. The excess of doing, this gets into the next paragraph. The excess of doing, e.g., a flurry of activity, mechanical, overstimulated, and the excess of undergoing, i.e., of receptivity, e.g., a flitting, a sipping, hinder one's being given meaning or coming to perceive it for themselves. Further, Dewey's instrumentalist view of knowledge and meaning are akin to Aristotelian and utilitarian means and reasoning. And this is back to Dewey's text. Experience is limited by all the causes which interfere with perception of the relations between undergoing and doing. There may be interference because of excess on the side of doing, or of excess on the side of receptivity of undergoing. Unbalance on either side blurs the perception of relations and leaves the experience partial and distorted with scant or false meaning. Zeal for doing, lust for action leaves many a person, especially in this hurried and impatient human environment in which we live, with experience of an almost incredible paucity, all on the surface. No one experience has a chance to complete itself because something else is entered upon so speedily. What is called experience becomes so dispersed and miscellaneous as hardly to deserve the name. Resistance is treated as an obstruction to be beaten down, not as an invitation to reflection. An individual comes to seek, unconsciously, even more than by deliberate choice, situations in which he can do the most things in the shortest time. Experiences are also cut short from maturing by excess of receptivity. Or undergoing. What is prized is then the mere undergoing of this and that, irrespective of perception of any meaning. The crowding together, and so you can have too much doing, which is a multiplicity, or too much undergoing, which is a unity. Um, and earlier, the unity was a consummation and the multiplicity was a disintegration. But here we can see that it's the perceived relation between the two that is the consummation, or the true unity. So this is one instance where the smooth and the striated or other kind of one and the multiple dyads breaks down for Dewey, which is cool. The crowding together of as many impressions as possible is thought to be life, even though no one of them is more than a flitting and a sipping, which is also why sometimes you just have to reread things until it makes sense. The sentimentalist and the daydreamer may have more fancies and impressions pass through their consciousness than has the man who is animated by lust for action, but his experience is equally distorted because nothing takes root in mind when there is no balance between doing and receiving. Some decisive action is needed in order to establish contact with the realities of the world and in order that impressions may be so related to facts that their value is tested and organized. Because perception of relationship, tested and organized being a necessary hallmark of pragmatism. At least the tested part, value being tested against the world. Because perception of relationship between what is done and what is undergone constitutes the work of intelligence, and because the artist is controlled in the process of his work by his grasp of the connection between what he has already done and what he is to do next, the idea that the artist does not think as intently and penetratingly as a scientific inquirer is absurd. A painter must consciously undergo the effect of his every brushstroke, or he will not be aware of what he is doing and where his work is going. Moreover, he has to see each particular connection of doing and undergoing in relation to the whole that he desires to produce. To apprehend such relations is to think, and is one of the most exacting modes of thought. The difference between the pictures of different painters is due quite as much to differences of capacity to carry on this thought, as it is to differences of sensitivity, to bear color, and to differences in dexterity of execution. So that's the statement of the three components of intelligence again. Capacity to carry on this kind of thought, the perception of relations, to think, sensitivity to bear color or perception, and dexterity of execution or doing. So excellent perception, excellent doing, and excellent relating. As respects the basic quality of pictures, difference depends indeed more upon the quality of intelligence brought to bear upon perception of relations than upon anything else. Though, of course, intelligence cannot be separated from direct sensitivity and is connected, though in a more external manner, with skill. Again, kind of different ways of thinking of the three cores. Any idea that ignores the necessary role of intelligence in production of works of art is based upon identification of thinking with use of one special kind of material. This is why I made a point of that passage from the earlier in the chapter, again in this video. One special kind of material, which is verbal signs and words. To think effectively in terms of relations of qualities is as severe a demand upon thought as to think in terms of symbols, verbal and mathematical. Indeed, since words are easily manipulated in mechanical ways, the production of a work of genuine art probably demands more intelligence than does most of the so-called thinking that goes on among those who pride themselves on being, quote, intellectuals. All right, and that's a section break for Dewey as well, like a hard section break, not just a line break, but a triple star section break. Um, we have 12 pages left, and this is the moment where he takes all of that and starts relating it to artistic and aesthetic. So excellent doing, excellent undergoing, and the intelligence to relate the two. The perception of the meaning or the relation. Again, remember in chapter 2 when he described our tendency to think that nature is designed by purpose and intelligence because our intelligence is learned from nature's causations. I have tried to show in these chapters that the aesthetic is no intruder in experience from without, whether by way of idle luxury or transcendent ideality. Again, an eminent thinker. Works well with other eminent thinkers like Sartre and Deleuze and Spinoza. But that it is the clarified and intensified development of traits that belong to every normally complete experience. This fact I take to be the only secure basis upon which aesthetic theory can build. It remains to suggest some of the implications of the underlying fact. All right, let's do some more framing with the questions. So yeah, before we really move, maybe I'll read that again in a minute. Let's look at the formal answers that I wrote up for What kind of intelligence does the artist require? I know I riffed on it just now, but first off, one of my students posed a bonus question in class once. Does listening to jazz piano make you more intelligent? And based on what we just saw, we should be able to deduce or infer or riff or verbalize a corollary that actually listening to jazz music does indeed require following the contours of the complexities of it and its relations. Jazz in particular also depends upon the way it breaks other traditions and expectations, is my understanding. Um, but yes, it does. So the formal answer to that in the formal, quote unquote, listening to complexities in different sense language does increase mental activity and promote increasingly nuanced and complex thought forms. Listening contours and shapes our perceptual and cognitive mental pathways. Okay, other answers to 7. Dynamic intelligence is what the artist requires because they have to be able to engage with the world and interpret the qualitative sensory aspects with sensitivity and causal reasoning. Means ends reasoning, doing and undergoing in relation, in alternation and simultaneously. Awareness of the relations between what was just done and what is about to be done, of the relations between work and impact on the audience, which requires active listening, of the relations between process and product. And then, yeah, perception of the relationships of qualities, but what kinds of relationships? So first, process to product, such as in process, envisioning the product, especially how the vision of the product changes in response to a present perception of whether the work is affecting the desired result. 2, parts to whole, in the product, how each part contributes to the whole, i.e., to the anticipated consequent end result experience of the work of art. 3, parts to parts, how the qualities work together, whether auditory, visual, or tactile. And these are just kind of like examples. So if they don't match up or they don't hold water, that's fine. 4, artwork to audience perceiver, how it will impact between the independent product of the work of art and the experience of the viewer and or the artist. 5, moment to moment, technique, how methods achieve certain results from one undergoing to the brush on the hand and on the canvas to the next doing. 6, moment to envisioned whole, how a technique achieves the end. 7, adaptation of the whole envisaged in response to the present. See also above under process to product. So that was the first one. Because you envisage the whole there, but it has to be revised by what is happening in the process. 8, technical experimentation to find new techniques to achieve a vision. So you kind of like meet that resistance, and then you have to try something else. 9, historical differentiations, how different histories in an audience will perceive a work. You should like think ahead of that. 10, cause and effect, or I mean, you can't control everything. Like sometimes arts are just explosive and they create all sorts of unforeseen consequences. 10, cause and effect, method toward an intentional purpose. 11, doing and undergoing, common elements, all experiences. So yeah, I mean, those were just exemplary. I have tried to show in these chapters how the aesthetic is no intruder in experience from without, whether by way of idle luxury or transcendent ideality, but that it is the clarified and intensified development of traits that belong to every normally complete experience. This fact I take to be the only secure basis upon which aesthetic theory can build. It remains to suggest some of the implications of the underlying fact. We have no word in the English language that unambiguously includes what is signified by the two words artistic and aesthetic. Since artistic refers primarily to the act of production and aesthetic to that of perception and enjoyment, the absence of a term designating the two processes taken together is unfortunate. Sometimes the effect is to separate the two from each other, to regard art as something superimposed upon aesthetic material, or, upon the other side, to an assumption that Since art is a process of creation, perception and enjoyment of it have nothing in common with the creative act. In any case, there is a certain verbal awkwardness in that we are compelled sometimes to use the term aesthetic to cover the entire field, and sometimes to limit it to the receiving perceptual aspect of the whole operation. I refer to these obvious facts as preliminary to an attempt to show how the conception of conscious experience as a perceived relation between doing and undergoing enables us to understand the connection that art as a production and perception, that art as production on the one hand, and perception and appreciation as enjoyment on the other, is sustained to each other. Art denotes a process of doing or making. This is as true, and remember, our current question is, how are the production and the perception of artworks interwoven? And Dewey's really only going to explain the first direction right now for art. Art denotes a process of doing or making. I'm going to get a snack. I'm going to pause and get a snack. All right, add some more pretzels. Should be enough to finish this. Art denotes a process of doing or making. This is as true of fine as of technological art. Art involves molding of clay, chipping of marble, casting of bronze, laying on of pigments, construction of buildings, singing of songs, playing of instruments, enacting roles on the stage, going through rhythmic movements in the dance. Every art does something with some physical material, the body or something outside the body, with or without the use of intervening tools, and with a view of to production of something visible, audible, or tangible. So marked is the active or doing phase of art that the dictionaries usually define it in terms of skilled action, ability, and execution. The Oxford Dictionary illustrates by a quotation from John Stuart Mill. It's funny. I accessed the Oxford Dictionary on the internet, and Dewey cites one of the other, historical figures um in the Oxford Dictionary, which I mean it makes sense. Oxford's in the UK, and J.S. Mill was a British writer. Anyway, the Oxford Dictionary illustrates by a quotation from John Stuart Mill, art is an endeavor after perfection and execution, while Matthew Arnold calls it pure and flawless workmanship. Dewey's point here is that the aesthetic aspect is neglected, even though they're of the same process. The word aesthetic refers, as we have already noted, to experience as appreciative, perceiving, and enjoying. It denotes the consumer's rather than the producer's standpoint. It is gusto, taste, and as with cooking, overt skillful action is on the side of the cook who prepares, while taste is on the side of the consumer. As in gardening, there is a distinction between the gardener who plants and tills and the householder who enjoys the finished product. These very illustrations, however, as well as the relation that exists in having an experience between doing and undergoing, indicate that the distinction between aesthetic and artistic cannot be pressed so far as to become a separation. Perfection and execution cannot be measured or defined in terms of execution. It implies those who perceive and enjoy the product that is executed. The cook prepares food for the consumer, and the measure of the value of what is prepared is found in consumption, not in cooking. Mere perfection and execution, judged in its own terms in isolation, can probably be attained better by a machine than by human art. By itself, it is at most technique, and there are great artists who are not in the first ranks as technicians, witness Cezanne, just as there are great performers on the piano who are not great aesthetically, and as Sargent is not a great painter. I think there's a T there. Sargent. And as Sargent is not a great painter. Craftsmanship to be artistic in the final sense must be loving. Oh yeah, this was a nice point that I didn't mention in the overview. Um, done with care and attentiveness. It's like kind of a surprising moment for love to pop up, for a definition of love to pop up in an aesthetic pragmatist theory. But he's not wrong. Craftsmanship to be artistic in the final sense must be loving. It must care deeply for the subject matter upon which skill is exercised. A sculptor comes to mind whose busts are marvelously exact. It might be difficult to tell in the presence of a photograph of one of them and of a photograph of the original, which was of the person himself. For virtuosity, they are remarkable, but one doubts whether the maker of the busts had an experience of his own that he was concerned to have those share who look at his products. To be truly artistic, a work must also be aesthetic, that is, framed for enjoyed receptive perception. Constant observation is, of course, necessary for the maker while he is producing. But if his perception is not also aesthetic in nature, it is a colorless and cold recognition of what has been done, um, used as a stimulus to the next step in a process that is essentially mechanical. In short, art in its form unites the very same relation of doing and undergoing, outgoing and incoming energy that makes an experience to be an experience. There's a self-selection and self-organization in this next moment as well. He's going to describe another process that self-organizes. Because of elimination of all that does not contribute to mutual organization of the factors of both action and reception into one another, and because of selection of just the aspects and traits that contribute to their interpenetration of each other, the product is a work of aesthetic art. So there's a selection process, a mutual selection process. Man whittles, carves, sings, dances, gestures, molds, draws, and paints. The doing or making is artistic when the perceived result is of such a nature that its qualities, as perceived, have controlled the question of production. The act of producing that is directed by intent to produce something that is enjoyed in the immediate experience of perceiving has qualities that a spontaneous or uncontrolled activity does not have. The artist embodies in himself the attitude of the perceiver while he works. Suppose, for the sake of illustration, and I don't think I'm gonna um, until the artist is satisfied in perception with what she is doing, she continues shaping and reshaping. The making comes to an end when its result is experienced as good in direct perception. Production is regulated by the qualities of the product as perceived is how artworks make themselves. Present aesthetic perception of the work redirects what the artist does. The materials in tandem and interaction with the artist refine and determine the final product. Qualities are perceived either as belonging together or as jarring, as reinforcing or as interfering, and such perceptions determine making. Perception as gestation of a work of art is a form of organization, which in turn creates a further depth for a piece of art, possibly creating an entirely new piece. So yeah, when you perceive, you undergo something, and also the rest is a sort of gestation. Artworks make themselves by informing the artist of how the vision should change. They reshape what the artist intends. If they do not, then the artist is not undergoing aesthetic perception in the act of production, doing, making, just recognition. And the product will not produce aesthetic experience in other viewers. So again, recognition versus perception, reducing the present to the past for some other purpose, or letting the present redirect the past surging forth and enriching the consummate present moment of aesthetic perception, which always involves consummation. So the past creates the present as well, but continues to create the present. The distant past continues to create the present. And like, in ways that cannot just be reduced to some future state. Okay. Artistic production by an artist is a doing, but it is also an undergoing, insofar as the artist must refine their work and production through an active, ongoing process of aesthetic perception. Insofar as they have an aesthetic experience while making it, the work of art is more likely to produce such an aesthetic experience in the viewer. The artist refines their production process in response to a present aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience of the work of art is imbued in the work of art only insofar as the artist had an aesthetic experience while making it. The viewer has aesthetic experience insofar as the artist did while making it. Suppose, for the sake of illustration, that a finely wrought object, one whose texture and proportions are highly pleasing in perception, has been believed to be a product of some primitive people. Then there is discovered evidence that proves it to be an accidental natural product. In this paragraph, he'll argue for the importance of the intentionality in aesthetic perception, meaning we need to believe that what we perceive was intentionally made in order to find it aesthetic. As an external thing, it is now precisely what it was before. Yet at once it ceases to be a work of art and becomes a natural, quote, curiosity. It now belongs in a museum of natural history, not in a museum of art. And the extraordinary thing is that the difference that is thus made is not one of just intellectual classification. A difference is made in appreciative perception and in a direct way. The aesthetic experience, in its limited sense, is thus seen to be inherently connected with the experience of making. The sensory satisfaction of eye and ear, when aesthetic, is so because it does not stand by itself, but is linked to the activity of which it is the consequence. Even the pleasures of the palate are different in quality to an epicure than in one who merely likes his food as he eats it. The difference is not of mere intensity. The epicure is conscious of much more than the taste of the food. Rather, there enter into the taste as directly experienced qualities that depend upon reference to its source and its manner of production in connection with criteria of excellence. As production must absorb into itself qualities of the product as perceived and be regulated by them, so on the other side, seeing, hearing, tasting become aesthetic when relation to a distinct manner of activity qualifies what is perceived. There is an element of passion in all aesthetic perception. Yet, when we are overwhelmed by passion, as in extreme rage, fear, jealousy, the experience is definitely non-aesthetic. There is no relationship felt to the qualities of the activity that has generated the passion. Consequently, the material of the experience lacks elements of balance and proportion, for these can be present only when, as in the conduct that has grace or dignity, the act is controlled by an exquisite sense of the relations which the act sustains, its fitness to the occasion and to the situation. The process of art in production is related to the aesthetic in perception organically, as the Lord God in creation surveyed his work and found it good. Until the artist is satisfied in perception with what he is doing, he continues shaping and reshaping. The making comes to an end when its result is experienced as good, and that experience comes not by mere intellectual and outside judgment, but indirect perception. An artist, in comparison with his fellows, is one who is not only especially gifted in powers of execution, but in unusual sensitivity to the qualities of things. This sensitivity also directs his doings and makings. As we manipulate, we touch and feel. As we look, we see. As we listen, we hear. The hand moves with etching needle or with brush. The eye attends and reports the consequence of what is done. Because of this intimate connection, subsequent doing is cumulative and not a matter of caprice, like randomness or sudden unpredictability, nor yet of routine. In an emphatic artistic aesthetic experience, the relation is so close that it controls simultaneously both the doing and the perception. Such vital intimacy of connection cannot be had if only hand and eye are engaged. It's the whole creature instead. When they do not both of them act as organs of the whole being, there is but a mechanical sequence of sense and movement, as in walking that is automatic. Hand and eye, when the experience is aesthetic, are but instruments through which the entire live creature, moved and active throughout, operates. Hence the expression is emotional and guided by purpose. Because of the relation between what is done and what is undergone, there is an immediate sense of things and perception as belonging together or as jarring, as reinforcing or as interfering. The consequences of the act of making, as reported in sense, show whether what is done carries forward the idea being executed or marks a deviation and break, another way that it controls its own development. In as far as the development of an experience is controlled through reference to these immediately felt relations of order and fulfillment, that experience becomes dominantly aesthetic in nature. The urge to action becomes an urge to that kind of action which will result in an object satisfying indirect perception. The potter shapes his clay to make a bowl useful for holding grain, but he makes it in a way so regulated by the series of perceptions that sum up the serial acts of making that the bowl is marked by enduring grace and charm. The general situation remains the same in painting a picture or molding a bust. Moreover, at each stage, there is anticipation of what is to come. This anticipation is the connecting link between the next doing and its outcome for sense. What is done and what is undergone are thus reciprocally, cumulatively, and continuously instrumental to each other. In the next paragraph, he's gonna no, I guess it's the next page. Yeah. A little bit further down, he'll explain that, well, what is done and what is undergone are thus reciprocally, cumulatively, and continuously instrumental to each other. The doing may be energetic, and the undergoing may be acute and intense. But unless they are related to each other to form a whole in perception, the thing done is not fully aesthetic. The making, for example, may be a display of technical virtuosity, and the undergoing a gush of sentiment or a reverie. If the artist does not perfect a new vision in his process of doing, he acts mechanically and repeats some old model fixed like a blueprint in his mind. An incredible amount of observation and of the kind of intelligence that is exercised in perception of qualitative relations characterizes creative work in art. The relations must be noted not only with respect to one another two by two, but in connection with the whole under construction. We already kind of hit on these relations. They are exercised in imagination as well as in observation. Irrelevancies arise that are tempting distractions. Digressions suggest themselves in the guise of enrichments. There are occasions when the grasp of the dominant idea grows faint, and then the artist is moved unconsciously to fill in until his thought grows strong again. And I think I said this earlier, that he has to find variation and continuity at the same time. The real work of an artist is to build up an experience that is coherent in perception with continuity while moving with constant change and variety and distinction in its development. When an author puts on paper ideas that are already clearly conceived and consistently ordered, the real work has been previously done. This is pre-writing tools will help you to organize this either within an assessment or before an assessment. When an author puts on paper ideas that are already clearly conceived and consistently ordered, the real work has been previously done. Or, like the pre-writing tools we were just talking about, he may depend upon the greater perceptibility induced by the activity and its sensible report to direct his completion of the work. And some mediums are different, like painting or something. The mere act of transcription is aesthetically irrelevant, save as it enters integrally into the formation of an experience moving to completeness. Even the composition conceived in the head, and therefore physically private, is public in its significant content, because it's intended to be perceived. So it's shaped, the content itself is shaped by an anticipation of perception. Since it is conceived with reference to execution in a product that is perceptible and hence belongs to the common world. Otherwise, it would be an aberration or a passing dream. The urge to express through painting the perceived qualities of a landscape is continuous with demand for pencil or brush. Without external embodiment, an experience remains incomplete. Physiologically and functionally, sense organs are motor organs and are connected by means of distribution of energies in the human body and not merely anatomically with other motor organs. It is no linguistic accident that building, construction, work designate both a process and its finished product. Without the meaning of the verb, that of the noun remains blank. Writer, composer of music, sculptor, or painter can retrace during the process of production what they have previously done. When it is not satisfactory in the undergoing or perceptual phase of experience, they can to some degree start afresh. This retracing is not readily accomplished in the case of architecture, which is perhaps one reason why there are so many ugly buildings. Architects are obliged to complete their idea before its translation into a complete object of perception takes place. Inability to build up simultaneously the idea and its objective embodiment, and they can like inform each other, imposes a handicap. Nevertheless, they too are obliged to think out their ideas in terms of the medium of embodiment and the object of ultimate perception, unless they work mechanically and by rote. Probably the aesthetic quality of medieval cathedrals is due in some measure to the fact that their constructions were not so much controlled by plans and specifications made in advance, as is now the case. Plans grew for cathedrals as the building grew. But even a Minerva-like product, if it is artistic, presupposes a prior period of gestation in which doings and perceptions, projected in imagination, interact and mutually modify one another. Every work of art follows the plan of and pattern of a complete experience, rendering it more intensely and concentratedly felt. It is not so easy in the case of the perceiver and appreciator to understand the intimate union of doing and undergoing as it is in the case of the maker. All right, so this is probably a transition to another moment in the text. 10, what three traits are required of the artist? Relations of qualities, i.e. causal intelligence, doings and undergoings. B, skillful action, technique, mechanical prowess, powers of execution, dexterity and production, i.e. excellent doing. C, acuity and sensitivity of perception, unusual sensitivity to the qualities of things, i.e. excellent undergoing. And then how is perception also a form of doing, making through surrender? We are given to supposing that the former The perceiver merely takes in what is there in finished form, instead of realizing that this taking in involves activities that are comparable to those of the creator. But receptivity is not passivity. It, too, is a process consisting of a series of responsive acts that accumulate toward objective fulfillment. Otherwise, there is not perception, but recognition. The difference between the two is immense. Recognition is perception arrested before it has a chance to develop freely. In recognition, there is a beginning of an act of perception, but this beginning is not allowed to serve the development of a full perception of the thing recognized. It is arrested at the point where it will serve some other purpose. As we recognize a man on the street in order to greet or to avoid him, not so as to see him for the sake of seeing what is there. In recognition, we fall back, as upon a stereotype, upon some previously formed scheme. Some detail or arrangement of details serves as cue for bare identification. It suffices in recognition to apply this bare outline as a stencil to the present object. Sometimes, in contact with a human being, we are struck with traits, perhaps of only physical characteristics, of which we were not previously aware. We realize that we never knew the person before. We had not seen him in any pregnant sense. We now begin to study and to take in. Perception replaces bare recognition. There is an act of reconstructive doing, and consciousness becomes fresh and alive. This act of seeing involves the cooperation of motor elements, even though they remain implicit and do not become overt, as well as cooperation of all funded ideas that may serve to complete the new picture that is forming. Recognition is too easy to arouse vivid consciousness. There is not enough resistance between new and old to secure consciousness of the experience that is had. Even a dog that barks and wags his tail joyously on seeing his master return is more fully alive in his reception of his friend than is a human being who is content with mere recognition. Bare recognition is satisfied when a proper tag or label is attached. Proper signifying one that serves a purpose outside the act of recognition, as a salesman identifies wares by a sample. It involves no stir of the organism, no inner commotion, but an act of perception proceeds by waves that extend serially throughout the entire organism. There is, therefore, no such thing in perception as seeing or hearing plus emotion. The perceived object or scene is emotionally pervaded throughout. When an aroused emotion does not permeate the material that is perceived or thought of, it is either preliminary or pathological. The aesthetic or undergoing phase of experience is receptive. It involves surrender, but adequate yielding of the self is possibly only through a controlled activity that may well be intense. In much of our intercourse with our surroundings, we withdraw, sometimes from fear, if only of expending unduly our store of energy, sometimes from preoccupation with other matters, as in the case of recognition. Perception is an act of the going out of energy in order to receive, not a withholding of energy. To steep ourselves in a subject matter, we have first to plunge into it. When we are only passive to a scene, it overwhelms us, and for lack of answering activity, we do not perceive that which bears us down. We must summon energy and pitch it at a responsive key in order to take in. Everyone knows that it requires apprenticeship to see through a microscope or telescope, and to see a landscape as the geologist sees it. The idea that aesthetic perception is an affair for odd moments is one reason why the backwardness of the arts is one reason for the backwardness of the arts among us. The eye and the visual apparatus may be intact. The object may be physically there, such as the Cathedral of Notre Dame or Rembrandt's portrait of Hendrik Stoffel. In some bald sense, the latter may be seen. They may be looked at, possibly recognized, and have their correct names attached. But for lack of continuous interaction between the total organism and the objects, they are not perceived. certainly not aesthetically. A crowd of visitors steered through a picture gallery by a guide with attention called here and there to some high point does not perceive. Only by accident is there even interest in seeing a picture for the sake of subject matter vividly realized. For to perceive, a beholder must create his own experience, and his creation must include relations comparable to those which the original producer underwent. They are not the same in any literal sense, but with the perceiver, as with the artist, there must be an ordering of the elements of the whole that is in form, although not in details, the same as the process of organization the creator of the work consciously experienced. Without an act of recreation, the object is not perceived as a work of art. The artist selected, simplified, clarified, abridged, and condensed according to his interest. The beholder must go through these operations according to his point of view and interest. In both, an act of abstraction, that is, of extraction of what is significant, takes place. In both, there is comprehension in its literal signification, that is, a gathering together of details and particulars physically scattered into an experienced whole. There is work done on the part of the percipient as there is on the part of the artist. The one who is too lazy, idle, or indurated in convention to perform this work will not see or hear. His quote unquote appreciation will be a mixture of scraps of learning with conformity to norms of conventional admiration and with a confused, even if genuine, emotional excitation. All right, so that's the end of that section on perceiving and making or doing and undergoing. So let's look at some of these answers before we read the last two pages with our remaining time. How is perception also a form of doing, making through surrender? Taking in requires activities comparable to those of the creator. Receptivity is not passivity, but rather a series of responsive acts. Otherwise, there is not perception, where the past informs and empowers the present, and it can change directions. But recognition, where the present is reduced to the past, it's narrow-minded, traditionalist, ritualistic, proceduralist, dogmatic, doctrinal. Quote unquote, recognition is perception arrested before it has the chance to develop freely. Quote unquote, an ordering of the elements of the whole. It looks like all the rest of these are direct quotes from the text, except for J. So I'm going to tell you when I stop giving quotes. E, recognition is too easy to arouse vivid consciousness. There's no friction. F, perception is an act of the going out of energy in order to receive, not a withholding of energy. To steep ourselves in a subject matter, we have first to plunge into it. Still Dewey. G, we must summon energy and pitch it at a responsive key in order to take in. That was G. H, for to perceive, a beholder must create his own experience. I, without an act of recreation, the object is not perceived as a work of art. And then J, we're done with the quotes. Perception makes the present with the materials of the past. Perception is always interpretive. Experiences and perceptions change over time, even from the same person. Years later, you experience your hometown or familiar favorites, such as comfort foods, memorable songs, etc., differently, strangely. Present, unique, coherent perceptions are the consummation fulfillment of the original making as fresh makings. The viewer creates a specific construction of the work of art unique to them. Active yielding of the self to meet the demands of a present perception is, and that's effortful listening. There is a different listening making the first time a piece of music is heard imperfectly versus a later, more detailed perception when the same piece of music is heard and understood more perfectly and thoroughly. The same with any kind of text or reading. The viewer must recreate the artwork in their own experience, learning, and summon energies to match the demands of what you're perceiving, pitched at a responsive key. Receptivity is not passivity. All right. Which characteristics of experience are dominant in aesthetic experience? So we'll cover these last three questions after we finish reading, or as we read. The considerations that have been presented imply both the community and the unlikeness, because of specific emphasis, of an experience in its pregnant sense and aesthetic experience. The former has aesthetic quality, otherwise its materials would not be rounded out into a single coherent experience. It is not possible to divide in a vital experience the practical, emotional, and intellectual from one another, and to set the properties of one over against the characteristics of the others. The emotional phase binds parts together into a single whole. Intellectual simply names the fact that the experience has meaning. Practical indicates that the organism is interacting with events and objects which surround it. I think I mostly gave that definition to begin with. The most elaborate philosophic or scientific inquiry and the most ambitious industrial or political enterprise has, when its different ingredients constitute an integral experience, aesthetic quality. For then its varied parts are linked to one another and do not merely succeed one another, and the parts, through their experience linkage, move toward a consummation and close, not merely to cessation in time. This consummation, moreover, does not wait in consciousness for the whole undertaking to be finished. It is anticipated throughout and is recurrently savored with special intensity. It's also taken as a guide direction. Nevertheless, the experiences in question are dominantly intellectual or practical rather than distinctively aesthetic because of the interest and purpose that initiate and control them. In an intellectual experience, the conclusion has value on its own account. It can be extracted as a formula or as a truth, and can be used in its independent entirety as factor and guide in other inquiries. In a work of art, there is no such single self-sufficient deposit, although, like I said, we do get a guide along the way in pursuing the aesthetic. The end, the terminus, is significant not by itself, but as the integration of the parts. It has no other existence. So the aesthetic helps us mediate conflicting influences on a creation. A drama or novel is not the final sentence, even if the characters are disposed of as living happily ever after. In a distinctively aesthetic experience, um, characteristics that are subdued in other experiences are dominant. I said this earlier, that what is unique to aesthetic experience is what is latent or hidden in the other experiences. Those that are subordinate are controlling, namely the characteristics in virtue of which the experience is an integrated, complete experience on its own account. In every experience, in every integral experience, there is form because there is dynamic organization. I call the organization dynamic because it takes time to complete it, because it is a growth. There is inception, development, fulfillment. Material is ingested and digested through interaction with that vital organization of the results of prior experience that constitutes the mind of the worker. Incubation goes on until what is conceived is brought forth and is rendered perceptible as part of the common world. An aesthetic experience can be crowded into a moment only in the sense that a climax of prior long enduring processes may arrive in an outstanding movement which so sweeps everything else into it that all else is forgotten. That which distinguishes an experience as aesthetic is conversion of resistance and tensions, of excitations that in themselves are temptations to diversion, into a movement toward an inclusive and fulfilling close. Sorry, my eye is bothering me. And, maybe you need a minute to process everything we're reading. Experiencing like breathing is a rhythm of intakings and outgivings. Their succession is punctuated, and this is the next question. What do James's birds, flights, and perchings symbolize or represent? Their succession is experiencing like breathing is a rhythm of intakings and outgivings. Their succession is punctuated and made a rhythm by the existence of intervals, periods in which one phase is ceasing and the other is inchoate and preparing. William James aptly compared the course of a conscious experience to the alternate flights and perchings of a bird. The flights and perchings are intimately connected with one another. They are not so many unrelated lightings, succeeded by a number of equally unrelated hoppings. Each resting place and experience is an undergoing in which is absorbed and taken home the consequences of prior doing. And unless the doing is that of utter caprice or sheer routine, each doing carries in itself meaning that has been extracted and conserved. As with the advance of an army, all gains from what has been already effected are periodically consolidated and always with a view to what is to be done next. If we move too rapidly, we get away from the base of supplies, of accrued meanings, and then the experience is flustered, thin, and confused. But if we dawdle too long after having extracted a net value, experience perishes of inanition. 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 It's a hard word to say. But like boredom, I think. And I think this is the last paragraph. So let's look at the answer to that real quick. So I think the last question is the last paragraph. But what do James's birds' flights and perchings symbolize or represent? That growth involves nested back and forth rhythms, undulating within each other, always inchoate and developing in germ and out of germ. Let's look through some different dyads. Flights and perchings, doing and undergoing, making and perceiving, activity and rest, accruing energy, accumulation and consolidation, intaking and outgivings, I should say intakings and outgivings, as well as ingivings and outtakings in the other direction, producing and incubating, expressing and impressing. And yeah, again, like Dewey's point is that doing and undergoing are intercalated on with each other like that. Always in each other at every moment in oscillating, alternating rhythms. Final question, when, under what conditions, is an object peculiarly and dominantly aesthetic? The answer being, an object is peculiarly and dominantly aesthetic, quote, when the factors that determine anything which can be called an experience are lifted high above the threshold of perception and are made manifest for their own sake, becoming relevant and beneficial to all live creatures. So let's look at the army example again, or let's just look at the whole flights and perchings final two paragraphs. Experiencing like breathing is a rhythm of intakings and outgivings. Their succession is punctuated and made a rhythm by the existence of intervals, places between the punctuations, periods in which one phase is ceasing and the other is inchoate or in preparing. So intervals are these places of transition or multiplicity. William James aptly compared the course of a conscious experience to the alternate flights and perchings of a bird. The flights and perchings are intimately connected with one another. They are not so many unrelated lightings, succeeded by a number of equally unrelated hoppings. Each resting place and experience is an undergoing, in which is absorbed and taken home, or gestates, the consequences of prior doing. And unless the doing is that of utter caprice, like uncontrollable volatility or change, or sheer routine, then each doing carries in itself the meaning that has been extracted and conserved. As with the advance of an army, All gains from what has been already affected are periodically consolidated, and always with a view to what is to be done next. If we move too rapidly, we get away from the base of supplies, of accrued meanings, and the experience is flustered, thin, and confused. If we dawdle too long after having extracted a net value, experience perishes of inanition. The form of the whole is therefore present in every member, fulfilling, consummating are continuous functions, not mere ends located at one place only. An engraver, painter, or writer is in process of completing at every stage of his work. He must at each point retain and sum up what has gone before as a whole and with reference to a whole to come. Otherwise, there is no consistency and no security in his successive acts. The series of doings in the rhythm of experience give variety and movement. They save the work from monotony and useless repetitions. The undergoings are the corresponding elements in the rhythm, and they supply unity. This roughly maps on with the dyad that I set up earlier. Although I argued that the consummation happens through the understanding, the perception of the two intercalated. They supply unity. They save the work from the aimlessness of a mere succession of excitations. An object is peculiarly and dominantly aesthetic, yielding the enjoyment characteristic of aesthetic perception, when the factors that determine anything which can be called an experience are lifted high above the threshold of perception and are made manifest for their own sake. All right, guys. That's been the hour and a half mark. That's the entirety of the text. That's all of our guiding questions. That's all the answers to the guiding questions. And that's the end of our series on John Dewey's Aesthetic Pragmatism, or Art in Art as Experience, chapters 1 through 3. That's also the end of our unit on American pragmatism in my Introduction to Philosophy class. So it's a nice little bow on the aesthetic experience of the unit and the text and the meaning of it all. It makes sense to me. My experience feels complete, which means that I'm probably just going to end the video soon. I can't quite think of what else I might want to show you. We can, I guess, look at some of the pictures. Let me pause. There's a few decent pictures, I think. Okay. So we got some fun stuff here. Yeah, there's a lot of the information on this picture is the same, but there's some multicolored rhythms where you can start to think about intercalating or how the rhythms are intercalated, or how the components of experience are intercalated, meaning like aspectually entangled, or like polyvalent or polyexpressive, multidimensionally expressive. Um, Growth involves nested back and forth rhythms, undulating within each other, always inchoate and developing. Experience always includes both doing and undergoing and oscillation simultaneously. But you also get to see my students complain about Dewey, or what their thoughts on him were. Hobbes would beat Dewey and Kant both up in a fight. Aristotle's old, and I like him better. I still like Kant better. He's more organized. You should also give Kant more respect. Dewey talks a lot, but he has something to say with every word. You just have to read it multiple times, dive into it, get lost in the sauce. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to say these students' names. Um, it's in the picture, but Dewey says a lot with a few words, terse, dense. Aristotle and Descartes are better at being terse and dense somehow. Real world relevance examples. Um, I don't know who said this. He's bored. Dewey's bored. The complexity is necessary while cutting away excess to satisfy intellect's demands for sophistication and rigor. It's being thorough. I think that was my answer, my response to them. And then I like Dewey and a lot of thinkers a lot better than Mill. I feel like pretty much I should that was supposed to say I feel like I like pretty much everything Dewey or I feel like pretty much everything Dewey said is valid. No one has the answer or knows anything. Dewey talks a lot. I wish he would simplify some things, even though he leaves a lot of room for interpretation. I liked Plato more. I prefer the dialogue format of Plato, but Dewey wasn't bad. Hard to approach, but not unwieldy, and still interesting and important. I thought it was pretty good. Reading it together was helpful. Too extra, exploratory, and described too much. Purposeless and unclear. Could have been focused. I like that he talks about art and aesthetics. I don't like his last name. Get a new one. I like his name. It's like the name you'd have in a children's book. Aesthetic perception seems subjective, so Dewey seems incorrect. I like Dewey and how he perceives that each thing has its own emotions, both as uniqueness and that emotions are in the world. Dewey's got nothing on Plato and Aristotle. They all talk too much. I like that Dewey talked about everyday stuff. Thanks for your patience, guys. Uh, really enjoy my students. I also really enjoy these philosophers and getting to just talk about them for a little while. So, that's it for this unit, for this text, for this lecture series, this video. We have one more unit after this, in my intro class. So yeah, good luck on the exam. Let me know if you need anything in future semesters or whatever semester we're watching this. If any of this is confusing, try watching it again. Look at the study guide and the guiding questions, the answers to them, and reread the original text. Circle it, annotate it. Also send me questions about more specific things that are confusing, but to the best of your ability, use the group resources that I try to leave as like, I guess a work of art that will outlive me in a way. Um, so thanks for being here. Take care. Um, I didn't end yet. Thanks for being here. Take care. Be well. Animals are resting. If you're a student of mine and you need something, let me know. If it's urgent, use emergency services, obviously. And be kind. Just be well, guys. Thanks again.